Crumbling schools and by-elections on the way. It's the first day of term, and this is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative MP Bim Afolami, Labour's Liz Kendall, former Jeremy Corbyn advisor Andrew Fisher, and Inaya Folarin-Iman, director of the Equiano project that focuses on issues of race, culture and politics. Today, it's the start of a new term, but with crumbling concrete closing school buildings, not perhaps the one the government wanted.
I know that it was difficult, and it's very difficult for parents, and it's difficult for those schools that are impacted, but I do believe it's the right decision, and I do believe it's really important to put the safety of children and staff working in the schools as the #1 priority.
I can think of a no more defining image about the last 13 years of Conservative government than children being sat in classrooms under metal props to prevent the ceilings literally falling in on their heads.
Bullying is never acceptable.
The former Education Secretary is found by an independent panel to have bullied a colleague. Keir Starmer reshuffles his shadow cabinet. We'll bring you the details. Can reaching net zero be cost-free?
We're absolutely committed, but we need to do it in a way that recognises that ordinary families are feeling the pinch.
Well, welcome everyone and to all of our guests. Let's start with some breaking news because Liz Kendall, our guest here, has a new job. Let's have a look at the Labour Party tweet. Literally, in the last few moments as she came into the studio, Liz Kendall, Leicester Liz, has been appointed Shadow Secretary of State for Work and Pensions. A big promotion for you from being Care Minister. We'll talk about the Shadow Cabinet reshuffle in more detail later on and, of course, ask you about your new job. But let's start with something else at the beginning of the programme. It is the start of term. Let's just show you this headline in The Guardian. Jamie Oliver calls for free school meals to be extended across England. Now, it's referring to the universal rollout in London's state-funded primary schools for the new academic year. He would like to see it universally spread across the country because from today, free school meals will be offered to all primary school pupils across London for a year. So, Bim, starting with you, do you agree with Jamie Oliver? Should it be for all state primary school pupils to get free school meals in England?
I don't think necessarily that's what we need to do, but I think that we need to make sure that those who need free school meals get them, and that's indeed what the policy is at the moment. I think really this is a question of priorities. Sadiq Khan in London has chosen to do it for a year, I've noticed. He hasn't chosen to do it all the way through.
It's quite significant.
He's chosen to do it for a year because ultimately that money has to come from somewhere and that has to be traded off against other priorities. But look, he's made that decision in London. He's going to have to explain where he's going to find the money from that from or where he's taking money away from. But I don't think it makes sense necessarily for young people that can afford it to necessarily have it free.
Right, and Liz Kendall, Labour agrees about ruling out, in fact, as the party has, introducing free school meals for all children in England if you win the general election. So is Sadiq Khan wrong?
I think it's brilliant that Sadiq has found the money to be able to do this in London. In my own city, in Leicester, I chair the programme Feeding Leicester to end hunger in the city, and so I know how important it is.
But you don't want to see it rolled out?
Have hungry minds, not hungry bellies.
But you don't want it rolled out across England?
What we have said we'll do is for every primary school child to have breakfast clubs. That is important because it helps children be ready to learn, it helps improve attendance, and it also helps in terms of parents who really need those extra hours in the morning for their kids so they can go to work. That's our priority as a first step.
But you're making the argument, aren't you, Liz, then, for if it's good enough for schools in London and for pupils there, then why not good enough for all?
Well, we want something for pupils right across the country in every primary school, which is those breakfast clubs, because it is vital that children start school ready to learn, and that's a huge part of it.
Why don't you now, in your new role in the Shadow Cabinet, you could be the Work and Pensions Secretary next year after the general election, commit to free school meals for all primary school children in England?
Because I think that if you make a commitment, you need to show how you will pay for it. Sadiq has done that in London. We have no idea what the state of the economy is going to be under this government in 12 weeks, let alone 6 months or 12 months' time. So we will only set out commitments when we show how we pay for them. But we absolutely believe in tackling child poverty and making sure all children start school ready to learn.
Does Labour's Keir Starmer need to be bolder on issues like this?
Yes, in short, but I think it's a very good thing that Sadiq Khan's doing in London, and it mirrors what's being done in Wales and I think in Scotland as well, which is backed by Scottish Labour as well. So there is a consensus on this. It was in the 2019 Labour manifesto as well, fairly uncontentious promise there, and of course was fully funded. But I do think breakfast clubs are really important, and in Wales they're doing both. So I would hope in time, as we get close to the election, we'll see Labour in England, where obviously because education has devolved, we will see that commitment harden up and have both, like we have in Wales, where Labour is in government, because it is a really important policy.
Inai?
Well, the price of food has got more expensive, and also with rising energy costs, that a lot of families that otherwise would have been able to afford things like this are really struggling. I agree with Bim that I don't think necessarily the right approach is to just universalise it. I think there's other ways that we can look at it, maybe raising the threshold for eligibility so that more families that perhaps are experiencing greater poverty during the cost of living crisis can benefit from schemes like this. But I don't think the answer all the time is just to make it available for lots of families that can afford it and are quite happy to continue paying for it.
All right, well, let's talk about schools, because it has been and continues to be the big story as pupils go back to their schools across the country. And it is the state of hundreds, possibly, of school buildings and other public buildings that have got this type of concrete called rack. It's a sort of lightweight concrete, but in many buildings it is crumbling. Let's talk to parent Wendy Curwood. Her son's school has been affected. She's joining us from Workington in Cumbria. Hello to you, Wendy. Tell us the impact on your son's school.
So we received an email last Thursday evening with information that due to an update from the Department for Education that day that the school had received, that the start of term would be postponed until Wednesday. So all the students were due to start back tomorrow, and instead they're having an emergency inset day to discuss how they accommodate the students going back with the closures to certain parts of the school.
What was your reaction?
Shock, I think, because that was the first we'd heard of it, and being so close to the start of term, it's a bit much to take on, being that there are only a few days to go, and understanding that certain parts of the school are going to be out of bounds to all the students. We were given details as to which parts of those schools will be inaccessible, and yeah, to be honest, I'm not that happy as a parent.
Stay with us, Wendy. But what do you say to Wendy Curwood? I mean, it is a shock, isn't it? It's a bit much, to use her words, days before her son's starting back at school.
Of course, it's hugely disruptive. And the only thing I can say is that we're only doing this because we take the safety of your child, the safety of the other children in the school and the staff incredibly seriously. It's a lot easier to have not done anything and pretend that the problem wasn't there. We've rightly not done that. We're not only going to fix this everywhere where it appears, but we're also going to make sure that that is paid for. And the Chancellor was clear about that yesterday, and the Education Secretary, I believe, has also been clear about that.
And what about your son, Wendy? What's been his reaction?
He was a bit shocked that he wouldn't be going back to school. I mean, he's starting in year 7, so it was a big deal for him to be starting at school anyway. So to have this as an added stress to his start of the new school term, and also the new school that he's attending, it's a bit it's thrown him, but he's okay. He's taking it in his stride.
Right. I mean, some of the spaces are obviously going to be closed, as you have said. Important parts of the school. It's not going to be quite the way you or he would have expected. I'm going to talk to our guests now, Wendy, about the reaction from the politicians. Why has it taken the government so long, Bim, to address this issue? Concerns were raised in 2018.
They were, and of course, we've had all sorts of reports and reviews to understand the technical aspects as to what needs to be changed and where those things need to be changed. And now we're taking action. I mean, You know, it's a very
2018 to 2023, that is a big
It's not like
space of
something happened in
time.
2018 and literally nothing happened between then and now.
Well, is that the case? I mean, a ceiling containing this type of concrete and panels collapsed at a primary school in Kent in 2018. In 2019, an official advisory body, the Standing Committee on Structural Safety, said this type of concrete was a significant risk. New guidance was issued in 2021. We are now in September 2023 and schools are being closed.
Yes, it can be a risk in certain instances, but it's not the case that wherever this concrete has been used anywhere, the buildings are falling down. What we've had to do is we've had to assess all of the places. Some are risk, some are significant risk, some are moderate risk, some are low risk. That process has been going on, and then the ones that are the most significant risk, we're acting incredibly quickly.
Right, I mean, let's have a look at this from the Labour Party. Liz, is this reasonable? Rishi Sunak's Tories are letting your children's school crumble. Do you think your child's school should be safe? Rishi Sunak doesn't. Is that fair?
I think it is fair. We had the former head of the Department for Education say this morning that the department did a huge and thorough survey with detailed information which showed not just that this needed to be tackled, but it was critical to life. The Chancellor, at that point, Rishi Sunak, halved the number of buildings in the school building programme. So that is reasonable. And let me tell you, from my own constituency today, I've spoken to someone in an academy trust who said this is an utter shambles. Leicester goes back a week early. We actually had to remove children from schools. There's still 2 schools on the list sent to me by the Secretary of State where it's not clear what the problem is, and it needs sorting out. I think it has been an abdication of responsibility here, and if you ask me, you reap what you sow. And it was Michael Gove who cancelled Building Schools for the Future. I remember that in 2010 when I was first elected. Even he says it was the biggest mistake he made while he was Education Secretary.
If it's a shambles, and I'm going to ask this question again in terms of what Labour is promising to do, because your colleague Bridget Phillipson, the Shadow Education Secretary, wouldn't commit and won't commit to funding a new school rebuilding programme. So shouldn't Keir Starmer also be on that poster?
No. And I'll tell you why. Because in order for us to have a proper programme, we need to know the scale of the problem. That is why we are saying do a full and proper audit, publish the results. You cannot ask us when the government itself won't publish the information to come up with a proper plan.
Well, it sounds like it's pretty extensive in Leicester. Let's hear, Rishi Sunak's been asked about this, the Prime Minister, particularly about his role when he was Chancellor and whether he's to blame for this. Let's have a listen.
Are you to blame for what's happening now? And do you want to apologise to parents and pupils?
I think that is completely and utterly wrong. Actually, one of the first things I did as Chancellor in my first spending review in 2020 was to announce a new 10-year school rebuilding programme for 500 schools. Now, that equates to about 50 schools a year that will be refurbished or rebuilt.
Right, 50 schools a year, Bim, but actually we have heard from the same person, Jonathan Slater. He was the top civil servant at the Department for Education when Rishi Sunak was Chancellor. He said the Treasury was asked for the money to rebuild 300 to 400 schools every year, but as we've heard, funds were only provided for 50 a year. So he is directly responsible, Rishi Sunak.
Well, I don't think that's right for the following 2 reasons. The first is that the rebuilding programme wasn't just relating to this particular concrete. It's a general rebuilding programme, and there are other reasons why you may need to rebuild schools.
But they may have come across
this particular issue with concrete is something that is separate to that broader programme we need of rebuilding schools. So once this problem, I go back to, once this problem was identified, we've identified it, understanding where the biggest risk is, we're taking action to do it, and just to make the point around money, because this is important, we've said, and the Chancellor's been clear, we will spend whatever it takes as quickly as we can to deal with this problem.
When I spoke to the Minister before the summer about one of my schools, Parks Primary, there were 2 others that still needed looking at. Why were those surveys not done over the summer? I mean, it is just complete incompetence. And parents, if you think about it, children's education has been so disrupted with COVID. You've got parents desperately trying to hold things together and pay the bills, and now they don't know what's happening to their kids. I mean, it isn't good enough, because our children need that good education so they can build a better life for themselves and the country in future. And I'm afraid we are in the situation that we were back in 1997, where our public services have been decimated under the Tories, and it falls to Labour, I hope, to put that back on track.
You hope, but you can't commit at this stage. Yes, Bim, respond.
Well, if it's so terrible, then where are the details of Labour spending the money that it says it needs to, that we need to spend?
Is to publish the information about the number of schools that are affected, then we can come up with our alternative proposals.
OK, well, I'll wait to see your alternative proposals if and when they appear. My instinct is, on the basis of everything that you've said and on the basis of what Keir has said and Bridget Phillipson, the Shadow Education Secretary, has said, is that you will attempt to say absolutely nothing about your plans, because your sole aim is just to criticise without proposing exactly how you will make things better.
You're in government now. Do you think that people watching, I'm going to ask Wendy in a moment to respond to what she's heard from both you and Liz, that people watching will think decisions were taken by the then Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, maybe rightly or wrongly, and they have consequences. And we've just seen pictures of those consequences. Ceilings falling in, crumbling in schools.
Well, this problem is not something that started in the last few years. This was a particular type of concrete used by particular contractors over a period of time, which only recently we have identified the extent to the problem, and in some areas it's very significant risk and in others it's less significant risk. And so we've been very open and transparent about how we're looking at this. It would have been a lot easier to say, oh, well, you know, it's no problem, we're going to fix it, you know, at some point. We've said, no, this is a particular issue, we're going to focus on it and deal with it. And I think that's the right thing to do.
Wendy, listening to both Bim and Liz, what's your response?
I wonder why it wasn't addressed earlier. I appreciate it takes time to organise surveys and get into all the schools with, you know, all the professionals and the engineers. But as they've pointed, you know, has been pointed out, they've known about this for such a long time. To me, it just makes sense if the schools have got contractors in over holidays, over the summer holidays, doing building work, then why wasn't this addressed earlier to mitigate the, you know, the stress on students, parents, teachers? You know, the whole school staff has been affected by the sort of the last minute response by the Department for Education.
Bim?
I mean, all I can say is that in the instance of your child's school, what we need to do now is to make sure we mitigate the impact of that and make sure that there is no safety concern at all, because we could have just said, well, let's see if it's all okay, it's managed for the last few years. I think it's really important, however tough it is politically, or for people like me coming on TV, that we deal with the problem, we make sure that we pay for it as quickly as possible and deal with it. That's all that I can say from where we are now. Of course, sometimes some of these technical surveys, as you say, take time. It's difficult also, and I'll make this point again, to assess the scale of the risk. You know, sometimes something may have been used, but it doesn't appear to be causing any immediate difficulty. And other times, it's really significant and serious. Actually understanding that is something that's really critical, because we don't want to have disruption for kids unnecessarily. But in your school's instance, that's been found. We're going to deal with it.
Wendy Curwood, thank you for joining us, and good luck to your son when he does eventually start his new term. Are you disappointed that Labour aren't committing, because they haven't done so far, to a new school rebuilding programme?
Well, I think the position isn't really credible, is it? Because if schools are crumbling down, you're going to fix them. In the same way that if your house is collapsing around your ears, you don't go, well, I'll put it off for a few years and I'll wait and check my finances. You take out a loan if you really need it, don't you? You know, you get things that are an emergency sorted quickly. So I think Labour does need to be a bit bolder on this. I mean, Jeremy Hunt said we'll spend whatever it takes, 5 years too late, or 10 years too late, actually, from when Michael Gove cut the schools programme, which possibly would have would have mitigated at least, if not solved this, if it hadn't have been cut back so much.
But you know,
which is why he said he regretted it.
But you know, chancellors get requests for funding, obviously, constantly.
But if buildings are falling down, this is an issue in hospitals, I think in some prisons as well, we've learnt today. You know, this is something that needs fixing. You don't put these things off. And actually, what you end up doing is spending more when it comes to the point where it's actually falling down than if you dealt with it when you first found out. short-termism.
But Andrew will also know our track record in government, and it's exactly this sort of issue that we dealt with. And again,
I agree, so commit to it now. That's my point, I guess.
What we want to do is see the true scale of the problem. That is why I hope that we will force the government to publish the details about it and the audit, because people want to know that we will solve the problems the country faces,
by spending some money on it.
but that we will show how we will pay for it, and that is an absolute commitment
I agree, Liz,
from us.
but realistically, if it's 10 schools or if it's 1,000 schools, you're going to fund it. That's the reality. Because you're not going to say, oh, well, if some schools fall down, sorry, we just haven't got the money or we can't show where we get it from. You would fund it. So I think it is, in fairness to you, and I agree, the last Labour government did invest a lot. I was in porter cabins in the 80s when I was at school. I know what it's like under a Tory government where they haven't invested. But
And how would you pay for it? How do you think?
Well, look, it's borrowing because it's an emergency thing. It's capital spending. It's one-off in the same way that government always spends for capital spending. It doesn't raise taxes for capital spending. That's for revenue spending. You borrow and then it pays off over time. It's an investment like a mortgage.
How big a problem is this for Rishi Sunak and the government? I mean, metaphors spring to mind, don't they, when you see props holding up ceilings and bits of school buildings crumbling?
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, when this particular type of concrete was installed between the 1950s and 1990s, they knew even for decades that it had a 30-year lifespan. So I think that has been a problem with this government, and also successive governments, you could say, that only when it gets to the nth hour, when the crisis really hits the fan, then all of a sudden they're scrapping around to try and do something. And I don't think that is giving confidence to families and individuals within society. But that's not a way to run a country, that only when it gets to the worst possible point do we all of a sudden find a solution.
I mean, there are fears that it could be really quite widespread. As you said, it was decades ago, of course, when this stuff was put in. I mean, here's just one example. It's a hospital in Kings Lynn. I think it's just full of props, basically holding the building together. Thousands of props holding buildings together. Now, that's obviously been going on for some time, hasn't it, Bim?
Well, look, I don't know about that particular hospital, but what I do know is that, and if we're talking more broadly apart from schools and capital spending, you know, it is absolutely critical that we invest in capital stock, whether it be schools, hospitals or other infrastructure. That's why, as a percentage of our GDP, our infrastructure spending in this country is higher than it has been in decades as a percentage of GDP. So we are investing in infrastructure. The difficulty politically, and I'll be very honest about this, is that when you invest in infrastructure in this way, and I know we've talked about the schools issue that we've, you know, this particular concrete, but when you invest in infrastructure, it can take a long time for people to notice that, and it can take a long time for those things to come to fruition.
We've had 13 years, of course.
Well, hold on, but we've been investing in infrastructure, and I think that it's wrong to somehow accuse.
Well,
it's wrong to accuse us of not investing in capital, because our infrastructure, as I say, infrastructure spending is higher than it has been for decades.
The big problem the government has got is, we've seen this, there was a lot of discussion about this yesterday, is, you know, our debt now, our debt levels, 100% of GDP, first time since 1961. And people are asking, for what? For public services that aren't fit for purpose, people dying on waiting lists, can't even see their GP, trains not working, schools collapsing, and the highest tax rate since the Second World War. People are thinking, why are we spending? What has the government been doing? And I think this is the big problem and the big political challenge that is going to define the general election and what the campaigning over the next year is. Who really has a plan to grow the economy, to get the money we need to put into our public services?
All right, well, Liz, we're going to talk
about the key battleground.
Well, we're going to talk about what Labour may or may not do in just a moment, because it is the first day of a new parliamentary term, and there is already rather a lot going on. As you'd expect, let's talk to our political correspondent, Nick Eardley, who's there in the newsroom. Hello to you, Nick. Let's start with the former Chief Whip, Chris Pincher. His resignation, just to remind people broadly, in 2022 triggered a scandal which actually precipitated the downfall of Boris Johnson. What's happened today?
He appealed against the Standards Committee, saying he should be suspended from Parliament for 8 weeks, and his appeal's been chucked out. He is going to face that 8-week suspension. It will almost certainly trigger a by-election in his Tamworth seat. I think the big question now is what Chris Pincher does next. Does he decide to wait it out and wait for that recall petition process to play out over the next 6 weeks, or does he decide to call it a day. We haven't heard from him yet, but that is going to be a big one to watch, because by October we could be facing 3 big key by-elections. Tamworth, where Labour will be looking to mount a challenge despite the fact that Chris Pincher had a pretty colossal majority in 2019. You've got Mid-Bedfordshire, Nadine Dorries' old seat. That's going to happen on the 12th or 19th of October, I'm told. And Rutherglen in Scotland, just outside Glasgow, where Labour are hoping that they can show they're on a comeback up there. That'll be the 5th of October. So looking like a busy few weeks on that front as well.
Well, absolutely, and big test for both the Prime Minister and Keir Starmer. We saw in the headlines at the beginning of the programme the former Cabinet Minister Gavin Williamson. He's been told to apologise after a parliamentary inquiry found he had bullied a colleague in texts. Just remind us of the history of this.
If you cast your mind back just over a year, it was Wendy Morton when she was appointed Chief Whip by Liz Truss. She accused Gavin Williamson of bullying. It was a bit of a surreal story, actually. It was about text messages that he'd sent her about who was getting seats among MPs at the Queen's funeral. She complained, said his messages were intimidatory and that he was, in effect, bullying her. There's been an investigation going on behind the scenes for the past year, and the conclusion of the expert panel, the independent expert panel this morning, is that yes, Gavin Williamson was guilty of bullying, that he should apologise to the House of Commons and go on a course about his behaviour. It's an interesting one though, Joe, because I think, again, it's questions for Rishi Sunak, because he appointed Gavin Williamson knowing that there were some allegations against him, despite all those promises of integrity and professionalism.
Let's talk about the reshuffle of the shadow cabinet. A bit more extensive, actually, than perhaps some people had initially thought. Give us a little bit more detail. We, of course, have a new member of the shadow cabinet here, Liz Kendall, in the studio, who is going to be the shadow Department for Work and Pensions. But fill us in on some of the other appointments.
Well, if you thought that the government reshuffle last week was a bit of a damp squib, this is proving to be the opposite. It's actually quite extensive, more than a dozen changes in the shadow cabinet so far. Angela Rayner's got a new job. She's the shadow levelling up secretary now. Pat McFadden, a really close ally of Keir Starmer, is moving to be the cabinet office shadow. He's also got the job of campaign coordinator, which I think is going to be hugely significant over the next 12 months. He's, of course, someone who worked for Tony Blair, so I suspect a few people will be reading a few things into that. Look, there are a lot of changes, Joe. I won't batter through them all, but in terms of big themes, we're still kind of working it out, but there's a couple of things. Firstly, Keir Starmer's making a lot of changes, which suggests to me that he feels he has a lot more control over his party, that he can make the changes he wants without some of the blowback we've seen in the past. Secondly, a lot of the people who are being promoted, I hope Liz Kendall would agree with me on this front, because I'd probably categorise her on this one as well. There's a lot of people who you'd consider centrists in the party, not the left of the party, but centrists. People like Pat McFadden, people like Liz Kendall, people like Peter Kyle as well. Key allies of Keir Starmer at the centre of the party. I suspect by the end of the day, this is one that they'll be celebrating more than the left.
Someone who isn't particularly happy thus far is Rosanna Allen-Khan, the Labour MP. Tell us why.
No official announcement yet that she's out of her job, but she has tweeted a letter herself saying that Keir Starmer's found no place for the mental health brief in his shadow team. She was, of course, in that job until this morning. So I think there will be a few disgruntled people by the end of the day. Other names, just to mention, who've been demoted, still have jobs, but are on the way down. Lisa Nandy, demoted from that levelling up job. Jonathan Ashworth, there's some debate over whether he's got a sideway move or whether he's gone down. Jim McMahon is out as well. So, look, a lot of changes to Keir Starmer's top team still going on at the moment. But as I say, I think this is Keir Starmer trying to flex his muscles a bit. And just like Rishi Sunak, he's getting some of his key allies into key jobs.
Nick Eardley, thank you very much. Well, let's talk to the newly labelled centrist Liz Kendall.
I don't think anyone thinks that's a new label.
No, I think you're right there. But now in the shadow cabinet. I mean, first of all, about Rosanna Allen-Khan. I mean, she makes an important point, your colleague, saying that she feels now Keir Starmer doesn't think there's a place in the shadow cabinet for the issue of mental health, which she says is very important. Do you agree?
Well, no. Wes Streeting is passionate about this issue. I
She
know
wanted a
this
separate portfolio.
from talking to him about it over many, many months, how important it is for the country, for young people in particular, we know, who are really struggling. So I have a different view about that. I think that Wes's absolutely got it at the heart of one of our big 5 missions for government, which is to build an NHS fit for the future, and you cannot do that without having decent mental health services. And in my new role, one of the big challenges we face, particularly for trying to support the over 50s to get back into work and get on in their jobs, is tackling these long-term problems like physical and mental
One other
health.
big issue, which is controversial for the Labour Party, and that is, particularly in work and pensions, the 2-child benefit limit. Will you drop it?
I am proud of Labour's track record in government on tackling child poverty. It is at the heart,
a commitment
again,
of Keir Starmer to do exactly that, get rid of it.
And it is at the tackling child poverty is at the heart of one of our 5 key missions, opportunities for every child to fulfil their potential. You know that we will only make promises where we show how we can afford them. Because we have no idea what the state of the economy will be like. As I said, in a few months' time, let alone in a few years' time. But personally, let me say this, I am huge. Tackling child poverty is absolutely going to be at the heart of my work.
Will you look at
and
that?
I am
Will you look at
determined
that and bring
to
it
make
to Keir
promises.
Starmer?
I will only ever make commitments where I can show where they will be funded. We need a new strategy for helping children get out of poverty and build the lives they need for the
future. Does Liz Kendall need to be bolder on this? If Labour can't do this, what can they do?
In fairness to Liz, I think the issue is, at the moment, Labour is saying it's not going to raise income tax, not even on the very richest, which Keir Starmer formally pledged to. So those who actually could afford to pay a bit more tax aren't going to be asked to. Capital gains tax, where if you make your money from stocks and shares or a portfolio of buy-to-let properties, you're not going to pay the same rate as people who work for a living pay, which would be a very fair thing to do. You're not going to do any form of wealth tax. There are various models you could use for that. Not going to raise corporation tax, I don't think. I think they've ruled out as well. And you're obviously not going to raise things like council tax or VAT, which are regressive, I would hope. So therefore, you have to say where the money's come from. You can't invest in the NHS, you can't invest in social care, you can't invest in mental health, you can't have a fairer welfare system and raise children out of poverty unless you get more money in. And saying, well, we'll go for growth. Well, OK, you might do, but that may take a long time. We've had 15 years of stagnation virtually in the British economy since the banking crash.
You would also recognise, Andrew, that we have said that we will abolish the non-dom tax status, and that's how we're going to...
Very small pocket change. Come on, that's not a big tax change. It's going to bring in massive revenue.
If you think
and you've already spent that. That's not extra money for the NHS. That's not extra money for mental health. That's not extra money to tackle child poverty.
But if you think that making sure all children have free breakfast clubs in primary schools...
It's a very good policy.
Absolutely.
I'm not against it, but what I'm saying is it's quite small scale on the scale of what you are going to face when you come into government.
I think the big challenge we have on tackling poverty now is back in 1997, we wanted to get people into work. That was the route out of poverty. Now we know so many children growing up in poverty are actually in households where people do work. So how do we get people into better paid jobs? That is the key challenge. And that's going to be at the heart of our proposals for tackling child poverty.
Inna, whose approach is right when it comes to an election? Whose approach to these big issues about whether you spend, you're bolder, more Labour, perhaps, in a traditional sense, in Andrew's words, or Liz's more cautious approach?
I think Andrew's absolutely right that I think what the Labour Party has signalled to the public at the moment is that they're going to put themselves in a straitjacket before they've even actually got into government. And I think that what we've seen over the last 10 years, as Andrew pointed, has been stagnation and lots of our problems deeply entrenched and exacerbated. And the Labour Party has not come out with any concrete policies about how they're going to materially improve people's lives. It's all great talking about strategy and we want to do this and these kind of big, vague statements, but the material, concrete reality for ordinary people seems to be missing.
Right. Well, let's just talk about the small reshuffle from last week. Grant Shapps is now the new Defence Secretary, replacing Ben Wallace, and also we have a new Minister, Claire Coutinho, who is in the cabinet with the energy security and net net zero brief. She's a close ally of Rishi Sunak. Now, of course, she has got to manage a tricky division within the Conservative Party over net zero and the best way to progress. Back in July, Conservative MP Ian Duncan-Smith published this. You remember the by-election in Uxbridge. Uxbridge by-election shows why Conservatives must stand against net zero. The ultra-low emission zone played a very big part in that election, and there are many within the Labour Party who thought that is why they lost it, because of Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London, pushing ahead with his expansion of that. So Ian Duncan-Smith thinks the government should dump what he calls harsh net zero targets. Meanwhile, former Business Secretary Andrea Leadsom says this: we mustn't let Labour take net zero from us. Who's right, Bim?
Well, I agree with Andrea, and I don't agree with Ian for the following reason. And I oppose Sadiq Khan's policy in ULEZ, for the record, but being against the ULEZ policy, which is a bad climate change policy, does not mean that you should be against climate change or net zero as a whole.
But
right?
you just shouldn't have policies that actually promote it.
Well, no, but there can be good ways to promote it and bad ways to promote it. I think it's a bad way, because I think damaging the prospects for working people, particularly people who run small businesses, and stopping them driving into London, increasing their costs, is a bad one. But look, the broader political point, why I disagree with Ian, who I deeply respect, is that the problem with the environment is whether you're interested in the environment or not, it's interested in you, it's interested in us. There is no choice but to deal with this question. The question is, do we deal with it in a way that damages the prospects for ordinary working people, or do we do it in a way that economically helps the country and makes sure that ordinary people win and gain rather than lose?
Inar?
Yeah, I mean, it might surprise some people, but I actually agree with Bim. I do think that net zero is a laudable goal, and I do think we need to shift the incentives in order to move towards cleaner and greener energy. But I think that the two areas, let's just say transport and energy, for example, you have ULEZ, which is going to make life poorer for a lot of people in the country. But, for example, looking at other policies around making life more expensive for people, the transport infrastructure, buses, trains across the country, anytime there's something that's actually done, for example, HS2, it balloons in cost or even doesn't even happen as a whole. So actually, if we want to look at ways in which we can get people to change some of the things that they're doing, the alternatives are just not fit for purpose. And similar with energy, the Green Party and many other politicians have opposed sources that would actually get us off of coal and gas, so for example nuclear. So oftentimes the policies that are actually going to make us easier to get to the net zero targets, they're being opposed.
Well, I'll come to you, Liz, and just say ultra low emission zone. You were shaking your head. Well, it is going to make people poorer on a day-to-day basis.
No, it's not. The majority of Londoners who are on low incomes don't actually own a car, so it isn't going to affect the vast majority of low income Londoners.
The people that do are going to be affected.
Of course, but let's now reduce that down, because actually 80 or 90% of vehicles already driving in London are already compliant with the ULEZ, so they won't pay it. So actually what we're talking about is a very small cohort. Now, of course, look, Sadiq Khan has limited powers, limited resources, and he can only do what he's got the powers to do. This has been a success. By the way, the Conservative Air Quality Minister said that ULEZ has been a success in improving air quality and expects it to be when it's extended. That was Joe Churchill in 2021. So I think, it's predominantly an air quality policy. It's a public health policy, not a climate change policy.
Yeah, all right, well, let's have a look at some of the other...
And it's very important, because the levels of child asthma in London are very high and increasing, and actually doing something to tackle that is vitally important. It's not really about climate change, it's about public health.
Yeah, and it's been difficult for Labour because they feel they did lose the election in part, certainly, if not wholly, as a result of that expansion policy. But let's go back to some of the other net zero targets, Bim. The government's committed to ending the sale of new petrol and diesel cars by 2030, phasing out gas boilers in new builds by 2025 and all new gas boilers by 2035. Are you committed to that?
Yes, and to go through all of them, they make sense. The car policy and new combustion engine cars in 2030 isn't just a good policy in terms of climate change, it's actually really critical for our economy and for car makers. So that if we show that we're rowing back on that policy, actually it hurts the jobs that we have in the car industry. That's one example. Take boilers. Now on boilers it's trickier because there are some buildings, particularly old buildings or listed buildings, that it's harder for heat pumps and other heating sources for them to work. But that's the sort of thing that we should work with and develop. No, I agree, but we should... Well, they're not always. It depends. Again, it depends on the nature of the building. That's why that's a target, but we should make sure we can implement that in a way that does not leave ordinary people out of pocket. That's the point I'm trying to make. You can have the targets you've read out, they're clear, we're committed to them, but let's do it. Make sure we only do it in a way that does not hurt the pockets of ordinary working people. I just think that's a sensible way of moving forward.
So more subsidies. There's going to be more subsidies for people who can't perhaps afford to make that transition.
Joe, there are two ways of improving, making sure that people don't lose out. One is to subsidise it and the government paying the cost, which actually maintains the sort of market cost too high, or we make sure we stimulate the right parts of the economy to stimulate and encourage private sector to produce cheaper and cheaper ways of people doing it in a green way. And by the way, that is what we have done already in so many different areas, and we just need to continue doing that.
I think about this, and Labour thinks about this in a different way. We think about net zero as an opportunity to cut bills, to help tackle the cost of living crisis, to give us energy security so we're not falling prey to what we saw in Ukraine and Russia, and critically, to win the race for jobs and growth. If you look at what's happening in America, it is a huge part of the growth that we've got that we would kill for in this country. And you saw over the summer, bosses from Tesco's, M&S, Centrica and others saying, we are at risk of losing this race. So I think absolutely, it must be done in a way that doesn't clobber people during a cost of living crisis.
So,
and
Sadiq Khan, is the Mayor of London clobbering people with the ultra-low emissions
he's actually trying to do the best he can. And I would ask the Conservatives, why did they support scrappage schemes in Birmingham, Bradford and Bristol, but not in London? Is that about their politics? But the point is this, it's not just something that we have to do, although we do, in order to tackle climate change. It is about a much bigger, bolder vision. And I think the Tories are wrong on this, because I think people do want to see action on climate change.
Well,
they do, and leadership.
But it's the policies that are needed to make those changes and reach those targets.
But what leadership is about courage to do the right thing, lead from the front and make it work. And that is where the Tories are failing on this. It's all about this sort of internal squabbles, not about what's right for the country in a way that doesn't hit working people. That's the challenge, that's the prize.
Liz, I've got huge amounts of respect for you. I was not saying that this wasn't an opportunity. In fact, I used those words twice. What I was saying is, you can have an economic opportunity, but at the same time, be careful about excessive government spending and on clobbering ordinary people. Of course, it's an opportunity in certain ways. Talk about energy security, you're completely right. Renewable energy is something that gives us more energy security. You're completely right about that. You're also completely right about jobs in certain instances where we have sort of areas where the UK can lead in the sort of green transition. We should absolutely be taking those and encourage the private sector to do it. I think that to the extent that we disagree on this, I think it's that I'm having a focus on the private sector, relying on the private sector, the innovation in the private sector that we can lean into.
That is absolutely where we are, which is you believe if you give the long-term security of a long-term strategy, the public sector investment, which leverages in the private sector, that is really what you're seeing in America, and we have that level of ambition too.
Although, of course, the commitment for £28 billion a year invested in climate change policies by the Labour Party is going to be delayed and postponed
Well, we will ramp up to that. We've been very clear about it.
But that's part of why I was saying that I was focusing on the private sector is Labour has got that policy of 28 billion public sector investment. You say you ramp up to it, but that is the policy. Now, you haven't explained how you're going to fund that. Now, without rehearsing the argument we had earlier, our approach is different, which is to say we should set the targets, the incentives, and allow the private sector to drive that innovation and growth and bring the costs down.
That approach is failing, isn't it? The Committee on Climate Change has just said you're off target, you're lagging behind, you're no longer a world leader. So if that's your approach, it's not working.
Well, and then this, in Ira in the Times, Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, promises green policies will not hit voters' pockets. Is that realistic? Is he right?
Well, I think it's going to have to be the case because I think voters, according to the polls, in principle do support the target for net zero. But actually, in practice, when it comes to certain policies and making their life harder, making their life poorer and taking away their freedoms, and I think they're understandably very concerned about that. And so when it comes to changing the incentives, thinking about how we resolve many of these questions, I think we have to listen to the concerns of the public, and that's what was transpired in the election result.
And the polling sort of bears it out. YouGov found in the Times that 54% of voters think emissions reductions policies should only be introduced if they do not result in extra costs.
Well, I think we have to be realistic. There's a balance
Yeah.
to be had. I agree with what Liz said. Actually, if you invest, and if you had invested in an insulation programme, in housing, in raising housing building standards so that new housing is up to a better scratch, you can save voters money on their bills and on their, on their day-to-day costs. However, just like we did with public health concerns over smoking, we put tax on it. There will be a bit of carrot and stick in this, in the same way that we put air duty on flights, and we should ramp that up for the long-distance flights. There has to be a bit of a balance in this to deter bad behaviour.
A few seconds.
Well, I think that a lot of people will be listening to that and thinking, on the one hand, we're saying that actually we're in a cost of living crisis. When it comes to green policies, we're quite happy to make life harder for people.
And on that, we'll have lots more time to discuss it. But we're back. It's the first day back for Politics Live. I'll be back tomorrow at 12:15.
My God, I was having withdrawal symptoms. Fuck me. Politics Live is back. Yay. But we still got the Tories. Boo. Anywho. Hope you're all enjoying yourselves on the first day of Politics Live. We'll be back tomorrow with more doom and fucking gloom from the Tory party. Damn. Hope you all had a nice summer, by the way.